Our speaker today is Bea Kay, who's worked in children and social care for over 30 years. She's also a member of Sheffield SWP and a GMB steward. Bea's going to speak for about 35 minutes and then we'll open the meeting up for contributions and questions. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, comrade. I think this is a really important topic at the moment, and part of the reason I think that is because over the last few years I've been quite shocked by some of the responses in children's social care from people you would have considered to be left-wing in terms of their, progressive attitudes towards working in the area of child abuse, and yet many of them have been pulled into this argument about the Muslim community having to answer for the crimes of some Muslim men. And so kind of what that's led me to is trying to research really what's been going on in terms of that whole ideology that's come down from government, but particularly in the press, to kind of give people what I think is not only racist, but a very dangerous kind of approach to particular areas of child abuse, because it also is very, very harmful to the kids, as I'm hoping to explain to you. What I want to just give people a bit of a reminder of is some of the headlines that we've seen over the last few years about Muslim abusers, or the attitude towards people who've abused. The first one was in The Sun in August 17, where Sarah Champion, who is the MP for Rotherham, and people will be aware of what happened in Rotherham, and you would say Sarah Champion should have known better. What she basically said was, British Pakistani men are raping and exploiting white girls, and it's time we faced up to it. Britain has a problem with British Pakistani men raping and exploiting white girls. There, I said it. Does that make me a racist, or am I just prepared to call out this horrifying problem for what it is? And the answer is yes, Sarah, you are a racist, and we will explain why. In October 2017, in the Daily Mail, there was an article that said Muslim foster carers told a Christian girl of 5 that Christmas and Easter are stupid and European women are alcoholics after taking away her crucifix and stopping her from eating bacon. That was then the Muslim Association of Britain actually made a formal complaint, as they've got quite a good targeting of media, racist and untrue media reporting, and they tackled that thing. But what was also interesting is Sir Martin Neri, who is the head of the government inquiry into foster care provision, and no lefty by any means, was forced to call that coverage disgracefully dishonest. And a number of leading fostering agencies also backed him up in that, because it was so absurdly racist and untrue that even they couldn't hide away from that. And then in the Sunday Times in April 18, they falsely claimed that Asians make up 80% of child groomers. And again, after the Muslim Council of Britain tackled them about it, they with a complaint, they corrected their error, but they didn't apologise, and their correction said it should have read 80% of those convicted of child grooming gang offences were Asian. That's also completely untrue. So they're fudging and desperately trying to keep this image going. And of course the problem with all of this coverage is, for racists and the far right, most of the reports are actually, even when they're wrong, they're talking about Asian men. But for the far right and racist, Asian equals Muslim, and Muslim equals a child abuser. So you end up with this huge leap. And if you think about Rotherham, where we had, a massive inquiry into child sexual exploitation and the failings of agencies, and I'll come on to that in a minute in Rotherham, we also had 14 EDL and other far-right groups, 14 demonstrations in the space of about a year in Rotherham, culminating in the racist murder of Mohsin Ahmed, an elderly man who was walking home from the mosque one evening, killed by racists. And then the trial of the Rotherham 12, which I'm very proud to say the trial was unsuccessful and the Rotherham 12 were freed, but they were basically charged with, assault on fascists. And what we managed to turn around was the notion that self-defence is no offence, because of actually the context of everything that had been happening over there. This has been repeated in other towns and cities. It's not just an issue in Rotherham. I'm sure there's lots of stories that people can tell, but I am going to concentrate on some of those things because they're the areas that I'm familiar with. And I think the other shift that you've seen in a lot of children's safeguarding is the fact that they've now put the prevent agenda under the headline of the, nominally children's safeguarding. And in a sense, you couldn't think of anything more opposite, really. So some of the examples that you have is that the prevent agenda has frightened education establishments from having any kind of a debate, particularly in further education, but in schools as well, about what's going on in the world because they're terrified. Now, how is that safeguarding children not to educate them? You have the examples people have probably heard of a child who was reported to prevent because they wrote a story about what they'd done over the summer holidays and they described the house as a terrorist house and they meant terrorist. Absurd. I know of Muslim women who've been asked to go and see the head in their school because of their child drawing, a 6-year-old child drawing a picture of a gun. Now, I'm not a fan of guns, but seriously, what, young boys don't draw pictures of guns, and I would like to know whether they were calling white parents in for that conversation. So there's all sorts of different things that are going on. And the other shift that's taken place is Ofsted, which people again may be aware of, where they decided it would be okay to go into schools and ask Muslim girls to take the niqab off. Now, again, in children's safeguarding, the notion of a stranger going up to a child and asking them to take their clothes off is a very, very dangerous thought. It doesn't make it okay because it's Ofsted. So you end up with these ridiculous contradictions and twists going on that are under allegedly the banner of safeguarding, and actually I think are very dangerous and very abusive in a broad sense towards children. And obviously we'll look at that. What I want to do today actually is to focus on sexual exploitation, because I think that's been the area where it's been hardest, and there have been a massive amount of arguments around the left about what's happening. And we know in terms of press coverage that there's been, rightly, people arrested. A lot of them have been Muslims in Newcastle, in Sunderland, in a whole host of towns. But the way that the reporting has focused on this, you would believe, I do a lot of training around safeguarding. I ask the question of people, who do you think is most likely to sexually exploit a child or a teenager? And they will say to you, an Asian man, a Muslim man, because that is the way it's reported constantly to people. And, as I'll show you later, the facts are completely different to that. It's completely untrue. So just to explain, child sexual exploitation, we're talking about a situation, it's slightly different from sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is something that they describe as happening within the family or within somebody known to your family, someone you trust in terms of your immediate community. Child sexual exploitation is a description of a situation where a young person meets somebody that they didn't necessarily know, and that person exerts power over them to basically coerce them into some form of sexual activity. And the phrase grooming is used because what you see is effectively a trade, a bribe going on in terms of money, drugs, clothes, mobile phones, all those things that young people may want in exchange for sexual favours or whatever. And that whole relationship is something that's come under heavy criticism in terms of the attitudes of a lot of agencies. And I think there's a very heavy class component to this in terms of the way that young women in particular are seen by a lot of agencies in that situation. But to be clear, the law says if you are under 18, you cannot consent to be sexually exploited or coerced. It is abuse. Do you know what I mean? So whatever views people have about the behaviour of girls, and to some extent boys as well, the legal framework is very, very clear, and that's something that agencies have fudged absolutely massively. There have been a whole range of reports and inquiries in Rotherham in particular, but in lots of other areas as well. And although to some extent what those reports have done is criticise a number of the agencies involved, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with a lot of their criticisms, what's very clear is they haven't particularly gone far enough. But what they've reported is very interesting. They've talked about agencies, and particularly the police, being frightened about being called racist if they investigate Asian men. Now, seriously, you know, if you look at the track record of the police, you know, let's talk about Stephen Lawrence, etc., etc., then there is no fear, I don't believe, in terms of being seen, or not just being seen as racist, of being racist. The other interesting theme, as I said earlier, is that for a lot of agencies, the phrase Asian means Muslim, so their interpretation of even the descriptions that they're hearing from victims is very, very biased in that sense. There was a view from many of the agencies that Muslim men were absolutely responsible for horrific crimes against young women. Now, yes, to some extent that is true. I'm not saying, you know, abuse happens in all communities, and we'll talk about that. But also, the focus was on women. In reality, the victims were young men. They were black and Asian men and women. So it was the focus was very much on women, white young women being victims, and not about children in general, which is again a very dangerous assumption. And of course, the other thing was that the Muslim community needs to take responsibility for what's going on. And you know, you just have to ask the question whenever the likes of Jimmy Savile or whoever gets accused of, you know, sexual assault, do they say to the Christian community, this is your responsibility, or to the white community, this is your responsibility? Absolutely they don't. And actually what they do generally with white abusers is they describe them as lone abusers who are a little bit odd and manage to fool everybody, etc., etc. They have a very, very different sort of description of what's going on in that situation. There's a very interesting book that was published a few years ago by a woman called Jane Senior. Jane Senior worked for Risky Business, which was one of the youth agencies in Rotherham, that repeatedly reported their concerns about what was going on and were repeatedly ignored, not just by Rotherham Council, but by the police as well. And what she paints is a very interesting story. Her book's called Broken and Betrayed. And she explains that she was angry, not just at the abusers, but also at the system. The system was stacked against the victims. And she describes years of police failings and corruption, you know, very clear evidence that actually the police were seizing drugs, keeping some of those drugs, using them to actually create relationships with some of these victims who were being abused. And, you know, an absolutely horrific situation in that sense. That all their evidence was ignored, as I've said, and was never acted on. That the attitude, particularly of the police, to working class victims was they are promiscuous, these are working class girls, they're bringing it on themselves, they're not trustworthy in terms of the evidence that they're giving, and that they gave consent. They said it was okay, so what is the crime? Which is, you know, so damning. And interestingly, you know, if you look at what happened in Rotherham, when they did start to act, it was because some of the victims were perceived as more middle-class white young women, and therefore maybe this should be taken more seriously. And that, you know, again, is a damning sort of view, really, of the majority of young people inside of our society. And again, that, you know, they were aware in Risky Business of black and Asian, as well as white, girls and boys that were coming to them as youth workers, and that wasn't even written into the story, was it? That was something that was going on and being ignored completely. There was also an interesting review of South Yorkshire Police's handling of child sexual exploitation between 1997 and 2016 published by Professor John Drew. And what he found was that the police's response to child sexual exploitation was inadequate and had serious failings. That the recent recordings, one of the issues around being able to identify who victims were and who abusers were by gender and ethnic origin, one of the problems with that is that the recording was absolutely awful. What he found was that it had improved over the last 4 years, and if you look at that picture, actually they were looking at 65% of alleged perpetrators being white North European, 2.4% of the alleged perpetrators being white South European, and 19% being Asian. So
pause you?
You can.
I'm just going to pause B for a sec. Our comrade made a really good point there. Can everyone make sure their phones are turned off, please? Thank you.
Do those stats again?
Yes, I can. because it's so ridiculously different, isn't it? So, and there's more stats to come. His stats were 65% of alleged perpetrators were white Northern European, 2.4 were white South European, and 19 were Asian. So there, you know, the headlines are saying 80%, and this particular thing was saying 19. And I'll come on to some more statistics for you in a little while. What was also interesting in his report was that there was very little evidence that South Yorkshire Police weren't able to tackle what were seen as Asian abusers, that they were more than happy to talk to Asian men and arrest them and discuss the crimes that they were being accused of. And that their conclusion was that the key reasons for the lack of action on child sexual exploitation was too narrow a definition of what it was in the first place, a top-down culture, and the general attitudes to young people. That was what he concluded. So I want to look at some of the wider research around child sexual exploitation, and where some of the confusion around some of the figures come from is that there are that research now is identifying two particular types of child sexual exploitation. The traditional, in a sense, form of exploitation is lone perpetrators on or offline, who are you know, developing relationships, grooming young people, and then sexually assaulting them. But what has come in recent years is a new form of exploitation, which is called group or gang exploitation, which is concentrated very interestingly in the nighttime economy. And there's an obvious reason for that, and you know, a material reason for that, in terms of the fact that young people are likely, particularly vulnerable young people, are more likely to be hanging around the nighttime economy. They're much more vulnerable, it's much more isolated. You've got small, you know, small places of work where people, you know, isolated in terms of taxi drivers, all that type of thing, that kind of makes that if somebody is wanting to abuse young people, then it's a place where you can do it without being tackled very much. So we'll have a look at that. But it's that group and the research around that group, the gang and group abuse, that is where a lot of the headlines are being drawn from. Again, using the headlines and the figures wrongly, but that's what they're talking about. The figures as they stand at the moment are, if you're a lone perpetrator, in terms of convictions for abuse, 80% are white men, okay? And that is 2/3 of the child sexual exploitation that is recorded and there are convictions for. For group or gang perpetrators, the conviction rate is 27% for Asian males and 36% for white males. And this is the Children's Commissioner's figures. I mean, this is Government Office. This is not some radical research going on. This is the official figures that exist from government. But bear that in mind, that that's only 1/3. So your vast majority are the white males and the lone perpetration that they talk about. So what we're seeing is a number of things going on. There's a major problem with investigations being skewed, as I've also described. There's a major problem in terms of how these things are reported. Some of the research talks about young women saying, I don't know who it was that abused me because I was off my face. You know, I was being given drugs and alcohol. So actually my recollection is that I was raped and abused, but I couldn't tell you who it was from. How were those things being recorded? Or they may have had dark skin, okay, we'll put them down as Asian. Interestingly, the Children's Commissioner found was that abusers and victims come from all ethnic groups. There was a failure of agencies to recognise this, and it puts children at risk because if you're only looking for one type of person who abuses and one type of victim, then basically any young person who strikes up a relationship with a middle-aged white man, you don't worry about. So abuse can continue, but you're looking for young Asian men as perpetrators, so that's clearly not abuse. So you can imagine how dangerous this is. And if a young Asian woman comes to you and says, I'm being abused, you're dismissive of it because you're thinking, well, that doesn't fit the profile, that's probably not abuse. So all sorts of problems that go on in terms of the frontline reporting. The Children's Commissioner was very clear that white people are the largest groups of perpetrators, even, you know, with the gang group exploitation. They criticised the public media attention on high-profile cases, because what they recognised was that the high-profile cases are being reported, and people are taking that as a norm, and yet all those other cases that are being investigated and taken to court were not being reported on, and skewing the information in that way. They also concluded that the data on Asian, Pakistani or Kurdish men is gathered more carefully, because there is a racist element to the way that, you know, the judgment, particularly in the police, about whether you even take a case on and investigate it, because it is racist. Actually, there is an overemphasis on Asian, Kurdish, Pakistani men, because they're the people that they're wanting to target, they're the people that they think are the key to it all. And that would be reflected to some extent in the recording as well. Many victims actually also refuse to report a lot of their abuse because of fear of repercussions, and the connection in many cases to police corruption and police connections with this sort of thing. And then the other element, which won't be any shock to anybody, is that many Black and Asian victims were ignored by statutory agencies, and their families were far less confident to come forward, because actually their experiences from those agencies in the past, you know, if you think of Stop and Search and Prevent and all those kind of things, did not give them 1 ounce of confidence that they would be taken seriously. So even though families knew that their daughters and sons were being abused, they tried to stop it without recourse to the usual channels, because they didn't feel there'd be any, you know, any point in going there. The Commissioner also, So the other thing that I think is, you know, when you talk, when the press has talked about the Muslim community has to take responsibility for what's going on, there is no evidence whatsoever that any religious or ethnic group has a position that says it's okay to abuse kids. You know, if you imagine the debate that goes on across all cultures, all religions, from the very, very traditional to the very, very, you know, revolutionary, as we can see from Marxism, you know, we've got everybody here, that debate is exactly the same in all groups. You know, there are things that make people more, you know, communities more vulnerable, like isolation and whatever, but actually, on a broad sense, there is no evidence that there's a cultural bent towards abuse anywhere in that way. The conviction figures as a whole reflect the makeup of our society. You know, broadly speaking, the percentage of Asian men that are convicted represent the percentage there are in the community. Similarly, the percentage of white men that are convicted represent roughly how many white people are in our population. So there is no evidence of any bias, any shift in that way. But no other communities are being asked to police themselves, as I said earlier. So, what I want to move on to, how are we doing for time?
You're doing really well for talking.
Good, that's a first. Unheard of. What I do want to do is to move on to what is the real picture in terms of child abuse and where does it come from, because, you know, I'm hoping that from what I've said so far, I've squashed the picture that this is an issue for Asian men and for Muslims, but actually what is going on inside of our society. And the key thing is that even though we are looking, and there's a huge government focus at the moment to look at effectively what we call stranger danger, you know, online abuse, things going on inside of wider communities, that sort of thing. But the reality is, most abuse happens at home. Most children are abused by somebody they're related to, or somebody that their family know well, or, you know, in the odd case, somebody that they've trusted through the Scouts or through school or through, you know, church groups or whatever. And even that's a tiny, tiny amount. And there's a reason for that, and I'll come on to it. You have a situation in our system, you know, in our society, and you know, in most societies these days, where the family basically provides care in an extremely privatised way. I don't mean privatised in the sense of privatising industry, but in the sense of isolated, closed down units. You know, I grew up in a world where it said they're my children and I'll decide what happens to them. Do you know what I mean? That children are very much seen as the property of their parents. And actually, you know, it's only even in recent years that we've started particularly to challenge that. If you think about children's legislation generally, the piece of legislation that most social care, you know, authorities work to is an act that came in 1989. Education legislation has gone on for over 100 years, but actually modern legislation in social care is relatively new, and that was because of that whole kind of fear about criticising the family, because of what it means to, you know, the establishment and the church, the Christians, that this is a sacrosanct sort of unit that we don't sort of challenge in any shape or form. But actually, because of that, what you do is leave, you know, parenting and child rearing and everything else unchecked a lot of the time, and I'll come on to some other arguments around that in a little bit. But what you're also seeing, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, is support services being axed, being hacked to pieces. You know, so now, if you want to access support services, for instance, for young children, Sure Start, who people may well be familiar, has been cut to the bone. You know, huge numbers of youth services barely exist anymore. I think the church probably delivers most youth services or you know, charities these days. And, you know, therefore, accessing support for families who want to, you know, parent better, or however you want to describe it, is very, very difficult. But also what's happened is that whereas in the 70s and 80s, where a lot of resources were controlled by communities and they were given the choices well away from the councils really about how those resources were spent, now there's a huge hurdle that families have to basically jump to even be able to access services at all. So it's become very bureaucratised, and the hurdle is because there aren't many services. So if you make it hard enough, then you can pretend that there are enough, because most people don't even bother to try, because it is so difficult. You know, how many people are going to say, I'm struggling with my kids, and I've got to officially say that to somebody? You know, I mean, it's a really horrible thing to have to say, for obvious reasons. Abuse, you know, from as far as I'm concerned, child abuse has very, very material roots in terms of capitalist society. You know, in Britain, and I'm sure in other countries, but particularly in England and Wales, children have less legal rights than an adult does. It is still legal in Britain to chastise your child, as long as you don't leave a lasting mark. If you did that to an adult, you could be accused of assault. So your child, up to the age of 18, has even less rights. Whoever's doing this has less rights than an adult does. Capitalism as a system is built on oppression and hierarchy and inequality. What we've seen is the commodification of people in terms of work, but also the commodification of sex. So, you know, those kind of pressures and that alienating sort of approach to people and to our sexual activity is completely, you know, sort of governed by competition, commodification, all those kind of things. The image, that beautiful image of the family that we have, is completely unachievable, let's be honest. Do you know what I mean? That idea where you go home to this wonderful, you know, like the Daz adverts, where it all smells nice and everyone's wearing pinnies and everything, the housework's all done, and the mother who's doing it all looks really chuffed about it. You know, seriously? Not a world I've ever come across. But actually, you look at the role of the family under capitalism, it is absolutely there to provide free workers in the future. You know, it's free child rearing effectively, and that's become more and more clear as services have been attacked over the last few. So where you did have a slight shift towards some more socialised childcare, you know, the children who are most at risk are children under 3, because they are the group of kids who are less likely to see anybody outside of their mum and dad, because there are no services for them. Do you know what I mean? The most vulnerable group of the people are the kids that we ignore the most. There's no sense in that whatsoever. As Marxists, what we would say then is that child abuse is about our material conditions and the material conditions that people find themselves in. And if you think about parents who are desperately trying to work on, you know, wages that are getting worse, in conditions that are getting harder and harder, longer and longer hours. You know, they are, you know, if you look at Marx's analysis of alienation, they're faced with competition, they're alienated from themselves, they're alienated from other people, they're alienated from the products that they produce, that the environment that's around them. They have, you know, most people have multiple kind of historical, social, economic and psychological pressures that kind of affect our well-being and our attitude towards things, and then they go home and they have to deal with the kids. Do you know what I mean? To me, I just wonder why it doesn't happen more often, to be honest. I wonder how people get through all of that and then go home and smile. You know, it's a really hard world for people to live in, and amongst all of that, there's even more pressure for you to bring up your children on your own with very little support from elsewhere. Okay. I just want to give you another flavour of this, because this, I love when I do, I love this definition. The government's definition of child abuse, and no one's going to argue with this, I don't believe, is to protect children from maltreatment, prevent the impairment of their health or development, to ensure they grow up with provision of safe and effective care, and that we take action to enable that all children have the best outcomes in their adult life. Now, what's very clear is that's applied to families, it's not applied to government. If you think about it, if that was the case, they wouldn't be cutting services. If it was the case that children have to grow up to to fulfil themselves, they wouldn't be cutting wages, allowing 0 hours contracts. You know, when I was growing up, adults used to say to me, oh, I'd love to be 16 again. I seriously would never like to be 16 in this world. My heart goes out to 16-year-olds who get through all of that. I think it's an even harder thing to be. Your prospects are poor. You know, all those pressures to be, the person you want to be, have money, all those kind of things are very, very difficult. I just think the contradiction about the moralism from government and from the ruling class generally, through the media, all that sort of thing, about how we should bring our children up it's a huge contradiction then, as they take away those very things that we need to be able to actually do that. There have been some very interesting other bits of research which I won't go into a lot, but are worth people looking at. Wilkinson and Pickett wrote a book called The Spirit Level that was published a few years ago. I think Wilkinson's spoken here actually. And what they said was that in economies where the gap between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger, actually what you see is the level of social ills, social problems that develop, actually get greater and greater, and that they affect the rich as well as the poor, but obviously much more for the poor. So, if you look at this picture of Britain, the gap between rich and poor in Britain has been growing for the last 30 years, and therefore why is anybody surprised in a sense by the outcomes that are from that? And I think the other thing that's important is, because what we know is that the absolute key factor in terms of poverty is in terms of child abuse is poverty. It's there's lots of other things as well, but the key thing that will make a difference in terms of whether parents can manage is poverty. It's not just about money. It's also about what poverty does to you. And I don't know if people came to Ian's meeting. This is an absolutely brilliant book. It's an absolutely brilliant book. And I just want to give you a little quote from Norman Gerras that is in here. And what he says is, even above subsistence level, too meagre provision of, or equally the repression of, certain common needs will be the cause of one kind of degree of suffering or another. Illness or disability, malnutrition, physical pain, relentless monotony and exhaustion, unhappiness and despair. It isn't a surprise that actually under a capitalist society, if you're not considered to be a productive, useful worker, you're marginalised, your mental health is affected, you're more likely to take drugs, domestic abuse is more likely to be happening, all those things. And again, in terms of parental factors, mental health, domestic abuse and drug use are the key indicators in terms of risk to children because of the stress and the damage that parents are having to face. So, the logic for me would be, if you know that, spend more on services, support people, put in those buffers to help families to manage. And yet what we see under a Tory government constantly is cut, because their view of things is that it's the individual's fault. They have a phrase called failing families, and this is about this notion that there are some families that will never be helped. They're in a cycle of poverty, they're in a cycle of abuse. There was some reports people may remember from the press about generations of families in Glasgow, I think it was, living on the dole. When that was actually investigated, it was only something like about 2% of benefit claimants, something ridiculously low figure, who could actually evidence more than 2 generations of benefit claiming going on. So, again, ridiculous sort of untrue statistics, fake news, as we maybe call it, where they try and blame. And this is a constant theme, certainly from the 80s, where there was at least a notion of society having some responsibility for its children and its families. The shift in social work ideology, social work training, very much has been towards, this notion of, I'm not blaming academics, but away from a Marxist maybe notion towards something that is very much focused on there are hardcore families who will never pull out of this, they'll never be able to change. And obviously as Marxists, we completely and utterly disagree with that idea. So just to kind of wind up, even with the right level of support, okay.
Good time.
I think there are some very important things that need to go on in terms of our society. In terms of being able to, protect children and their families as much as possible, I think we need to obviously fund services much, much better than we are doing. And we have to look at issues around discrimination and inequality, because some of the traumas that children are bringing through, and their parents as well, are about experiences of racism and the harshness, the inequality of society that we live in. We need to be looking at things like jobs. Actually, what are we saying to children and young people in terms of the economy and whether you can plan your life ahead? There are some very fundamental here and now things that can be done. I'm a socialist, and obviously I believe in a socialist society, and I think, there's a much better way completely of organising child rearing on a socialised basis so that children get to have lots of caring adults around in very safe ways, and hopefully we'll bring some of that out in the discussion. But even in the here and now, there are so many things that could be done to protect children. All we see is the Tory government doing the opposite and to blame us, and I think this is very much an issue of race, but it's also an issue of class. It's working class kids that are being ignored, not rich kids, and that's got to stop.
Hiya, I'm Dougie Johnson, member of the Socialist Workers Party, and you know what? Things kind of ran true with me, what you were saying. I wasn't sexually abused, but I was physically abused by my father. I'd been beaten with a cricket bat, bathroom rail. He did sometimes, where he used to grab me by my balls and rip me, because I thought it was funny. I discovered I consider myself lucky because the world I came from, I discovered the way to cope with my pain was I became a heroin and crack addict, and I consider myself lucky, really, because half the people I know, like many of them who came out of the Frank Black homes in Leicester, who were subject to systematic sexual abuse, not by Asian men, but by white Anglo-Saxon men, and it's true is there was no one to turn to when I was a kid. Because nobody believes you. Nobody believes you. He's a great man. He didn't do that. Even when my mates went and told the parents to see me after going out for swimming, like the bruises all down me, was falling over or something. And time that we changed and started believing people when they speak up.
I don't think you can say too many times actually how systematically these people were failed, these young women were failed by the police. If you read the accounts of what these young women had to go through, not only were they just not believed, they were blamed, all sorts of lies, all sorts of sexist tropes about how young women particularly young working class women, you know, behave. There was all these sorts of ideas like they're from this kind of family, this, that and the other, you know, and actually the police were colluding with the abusers in some cases. Sammy Woodhouse, one of the main campaigners, you know, who was a victim of child sexual exploitation. You know, she was found in bed with a known abuser when she was 14 years old, and she was the one arrested. She was the one arrested. He wasn't. You know, that's something that she's then had to declare on a criminal record for the rest of her adult life. This is the legacy, actually, that how the police treat working class families, and that's the price they pay. But I just want to say something a bit broader about how I think this type of society that we live in actually distorts sexuality and how people relate to each other, you know, in that way. Because actually, under capitalism, young women are sexualised in actually such a way that they're treated as objects, aren't they? They're treated as objects. So in some ways, it's no surprise to me that actually, in the worst case scenario, these young women are passed around as things to be bribed, to be bought, to be sold, and all the rest of it. Of course, that doesn't mean, you know, oh, it's society, whatever, letting this behaviour off the hook. We absolutely have to challenge it. But I was in a meeting yesterday, and some young women got up and talked about how teachers dealt with their school uniforms. And one young woman got up and said her teacher puts a penny down her trousers to check that they're not too tight. Because if young women's trousers are tight at school, apparently that's distracting for the teachers. You know, teachers aren't allowed to see bra straps and things like that. And another one said, this is how young women are taught to think about themselves, actually, and how other people are taught to think about them as well. And also, you know, we live in a society where we're taught that actually talking about sex, talking about consent, talking about how we interact with each other, we are told that it's something shameful. You know, we're not supposed to talk about it at all. So it contributes to this environment, actually, along with the horrific collusion with the police, and actually the complicity in the police and the way they treated some of those charities, you know, and the social services that were actually trying to look into the exploitation. I mean, really, it just shows we need big change, don't we, to really fundamentally challenge it.
Before Tom begins, just the meeting's being filmed. If anyone doesn't want to be recorded, just let me know and I'll sort it out for you. Okay.
Yeah, my name's Tom Kay. I'm a member of Tower Hamlets Unison and a member of Tower Hamlets Socialist Workers Party. I'm going to apologise if my contribution's a bit garbled. I got called almost as soon as I put my hand up, nonetheless, I work in a school in Tower Hamlets in an area with 67% pupil premium. That's, you know, the government measure of disadvantaged students, and a lot of the students that I work with are, you know, subject to very complex relationships with their family, and unfortunately a number of the children that I'm working with at the moment are subject to abuse. And, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of things like the J report, and also on things like Prevent on day-to-day practice, because you see, you know, the amount of times that I've had to argue with, you know, fellow members of staff who seem to think it's acceptable in a professional context, who say things like, oh well, Asian families are more likely to abuse their partners and abuse their children, is unbelievable. And the truth is that you know, these ideas not only are, you know, reinforce racism, but as Bea said, undermine the ability of professionals to protect these children. And, you know, we know how desperate this situation is and how desperate the poverty is. I mean, people might not know, but last week the Labour Council in Tower Hamlets took the decision to close 3 of the nurseries which exist in Tower Hamlets. The truth is, the closure of those nurseries will increase the likelihood that the young children in Tower Hamlets, or it will increase the level of risk that they face. And you know, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was about prevent. And I apologise if people saw me make a similar point in a meeting yesterday about this. But you see, increasingly, I've got a minute left. Increasingly, the prevent agenda is being reshaped where people at the top of prevent are attempting to argue that prevent is actually about targeting the far right and you know, so-called Muslim extremism equally. This is partly a response to the real anger that exists, I think, around the racism of the prevent agenda, and I think we have to be really clear in rejecting this attempt to you know, somehow neutralise and clean up prevent. You know, let's be honest, the prevent agenda has been in place as a statutory basis since 2015, and over the past 3 months we have seen the emergence of the largest far-right movement that Britain has seen since the Second World War. Prevent is not stopping far-right extremism. In fact, you know, things like the prevent agenda in the J report are giving ammunition to the far right in order to whip up race. And I'm going to finish on this really by saying that what we need to do is get involved in your unions locally and fight for an anti-racist message in your workplace, and also that we have to do everything we can to mobilise for the 13th and 14th next week, because if we do not stop Tommy Robinson and his movement, the truth is these arguments will get harder and harder in every workplace as people are pulled around a wrong vision and a wrong understanding of why abuse happens.
Before Joe speaks, I mean, there's been really brilliant contributions so far, but just so people know, you can just come and ask a question. I know Bea's talk was quite exhaustive, but there still may be some.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to take up one of the issues. I know Bea raised the issue of Jimmy Savile in her introduction, and one of the things which I think actually happened when Jimmy Savile was got is that I think the British establishment knew that it wouldn't be long before actually Rhodes started to lead right to the heart of the British establishment. I mean, Savile was a big friend of Thatcher's, actually spent 9 Christmases at Chequers, just down the road from Stoke Mandeville Hospital. I don't know what the potential links are, but I do know there's definitely links there because of how they tried to cover everything up. I actually think around the time that Jimmy Savile was first caught, I think is around the time that they started to raise in the British press the question of Asian grooming gangs. That was the time, I think, at which they sought to play the race cards around abuse and around grooming, and I think they sought to distract every single step of the way away from the British establishment. Actually, when you think about where some of the biggest grooming gangs are, they probably are amongst the British establishment. You know, in the same way that you think, I know people have seen that film Spotlight about the Catholic Church in Boston and the exposure of the links there, the levels of cover-up around these people, around white abusers, white male abusers, is absolutely bloody unbelievable. And it's really worth looking into because, you know, in actual fact, the idea that these people can, I mean, I think it's remarkable when you start to look at the differences as to what happens to the children of the people in the establishment and the government and the children that they are supposedly the corporate parents are and that they look after. I actually don't think the British ruling class have got any claim over how to raise children. The vast majority of the time they get other people to do it. They get nannies in, they send their kids off to boarding schools, they allow their kids to be subjected to all sorts of abuse inside of boarding schools, full stop as well. If you even look at British MPs now, how many of their kids go to our schools, our kids' schools? How many of their children get treated in the National Health Service? No, they don't. They buy and they pay for all different sorts of treatment for their kids, but when it comes to looked after children that are actually escaping real abuse, children that have to be looked after by the state, they treat them absolutely appallingly. Their educational standards are really poor, you know, the levels of care, the consistency of care around them is absolutely poor, and I just think we have to say we'll take no lectures from the top of the British establishment about how we look after our children or what's happening to our children on the ground and in our communities, and I think we have to stand up and say we want to see a real fight actually around resources for kids in our society, around what's happening in our schools, around what's happening with Sure Start centres, you know, around what's happening with further education, higher education and so on. It's disgusting what this government has done to children and young people in this country. And I think the whole question around Islamophobia and racism feeds absolutely into their agenda of all the time diverting away the attention from the real perpetrators inside of our society, and they're the ones at the top.
Hello. I just wanted to draw on a point you raised about poverty being the real cause of child abuse. I worked as a teaching assistant for a number of years, and I've also worked as a group support worker. And we used to provide a service called the Saturday Club. I've mentioned this in an NHS thing earlier, so sorry if you're hearing this again. But we did a thing called the Saturday Club, which was a couple of hours every Saturday. Parents would bring their children so they could just have a bit of time off, really, or do the shopping or whatever. And we had a service user, and she was autistic, she was incontinent, she was deaf, she was dumb, she was profoundly challenging. You know, we had 3 support workers with her. And when the Tories got into government, in the coalition government, they cut all the funding to the Saturday Club immediately. My mum was head of social services, so this is the thing that's close to my heart, because I've heard a lot of horrible stories, but she had to explain to me, at the time I was like, why are they doing it? I don't get it, you know, and she had to explain to me, because disabled children are not high on anyone's agenda. And what we found is that within 1 week, now I knew this man, he was like your average white parent, nice guy, you know, fine. Within 1 week, he was calling social services saying, I'm the next Raoul Moats. I'm going to kill her, and I'm going to kill everyone in my community. So this, just to give you an insight into how quickly someone can go to a really dark place when these services are taken away from people. And you know, he couldn't help his child being disabled, and he couldn't help that he couldn't cope, and that's where we went. So yeah, I thought I'd just share that with you.
Thanks. I think the points have been covered really around the profile of various networks, but it is worth re-emphasising that if you look at network abuse, the high-profile network abuse, it's where adults do have access to children and the capacity to silence them, and that's why I think, you know, the network abuse within the church, network abuse within children's homes, network abuse by football coaches. These are all examples where, and I think absolutely the link between the nighttime economy and the prevalence of certain communities working in that economy is actually how you explain those very distorted figures that get presented to us. And another study have actually found that it was 86% of those convicted of sexual offences against children are white. But the other point I just wanted to highlight was just the scale of the crisis in children's social care at the moment. Even the Directors Association is saying there's going to be a £2 billion funding gap by 2020. Early intervention funding will have been lost by 70% over the last decade. That means that money has moved into late intervention, and that means that actually a lot of families are terrified when they hear a social worker is coming round, because actually a social worker is going around when things have actually got very serious and very difficult. The other thing to say is a lot of the ecosystem of support, if you like, has been absolutely slashed. There are no youth services in lots of communities. Youth services who have that semi-formal contact can often be critical in terms of spotting those young people who might be vulnerable to abuse. It's really interesting. I was listening to one of the Rotherham survivors speak, and she said that actually it was a youth worker who she made the connection with, because everybody else were wagging their fingers telling her to stay safe, but the youth worker actually could start to acknowledge that there was some kind of enmeshment and relationship there rather than simply seeing it as a bad man abusing her. The number of referrals to children's social care has risen by 140% over the last 10 years. The number of children on child protection plans has risen to 24,000, and by far the biggest category is neglect. And I think that for those of us who work in the social work field, the critical thing, of course, is to fight to defend services, but it's also to talk about politics, about socialist politics, to explain what happens in families and what happens there. Because I think one of the dangers is that if social workers and other childcare professionals are under pressure, they end up blaming the victims, they end up feeling under siege, they start to, in a sense, inadvertently buy into the demonisation of families.
I'm going to let Bea wrap up now for about 10 minutes, yeah? Okay, thanks.
You see, I think it is really interesting when you look at institutional abuses, so the stuff, you know, the Catholic Church, children's homes, those sort of things happen. The one common feature that all those places have is social isolation. You know, we have this huge contradiction, don't we, in terms of care, where we criticise a privatised family for not being able to raise their children properly, and then we put them in an institution, or we say the church will keep them safe. And we actually, they experience further abuse because those, you know, in terms of care homes, they're ridiculously starved of cash. They are isolated politically and socially, in all sorts of ways. And then when people do start to whistleblow, things are denied massively. In Sheffield, and every city's had their example of it. In Sheffield, the children's home where there was abuse going on, it was reported by staff on numerous occasions. Management investigations took place and nothing happened. And very interestingly, it was the black Afro-Caribbean cook, with the support of her trade union, that whistle-blew and forced them to actually look properly at what was going on. And yes, guess what? They discovered there was massive sexual abuse going on. This story is repeated everywhere. So, you know, this idea that we have a government that wants to know about what's going on, that cares for their children, when they're told, they ignore it. The Catholic Church is obvious. It, you know, government backs an institution and denies everything that's going on there. You know, the stories are huge. But I think the other contradiction we have is, I think this stuff around children in the niqab is fascinating, because what I get when I'm at work is lots of particularly primary school staff saying to me, how come we've got an issue with children covering up, but actually it's all right for 7- and 8-year-olds to come to school with porn star t-shirts on? They do. You know, I'm not blaming families, you know, but this is an image to me which is horrific. I was brought up, you know, around the feminist movement and stuff. The idea of anyone wearing a porn star t-shirt is awful. But the idea that it's okay for little girls to turn up with the Playboy rabbit on them, you just think they're, you know, ridiculous. And they are very, I think they are very much about culture, because it is, you know, it's white kids that are turning white, but it's also an absolutely massive class issue. The cuts that take place disproportionately affect working class families time and time again. And it isn't just about cuts in children's services, because if you're a family who's trying to cope and they're cutting services to people with mental health problems and to elderly people, then you're taking it all ways round, aren't you? You've got women. We've fought for years for women to be able to work and to be treated, you know, as respectable workers, equal wages, all those kind of things. And actually what women are saying time and time again now is they're having to go back home because they can't get care for the kids, you know, outside of school hours. They've got an elderly parent that they're having to worry about, etc., etc. So actually, you know, we're rolling back, the government is rolling back the gains that we've made as a trade union and political movement over years, precisely, but only for working class families. If you're rich, as Joe said, you can afford, you know, one of the problems that schools report for rich kids is that they never get time to be bored. They're constantly bombarded with activities and people and things to do. You know, actually, they're not on the streets, you know, chatting away and worrying about things, because actually they're equally occupied. They can pay for all of that. You don't have to parent if you've got money, because actually you can get somebody to do it for you, where the stress and the pressure is very much on working class family. And in Sheffield, You even see it geographically in the north of the city, which is the poorest part of Sheffield, where most black and Asian families are concentrated because they will be poorer because of lack of education provision, all those kind of things to themselves as children and when they get older. That's the place, that's the area where there's the least nursery provision. So actually the provision that does exist is actually disproportionately in areas where, you know, better off families can access them. And it was one of the interesting indictments of Sure Start when they investigated. I mean, I didn't agree with the cuts in Sure Start, but when they actually investigated who was accessing Sure Start, generally it was better off families, because there is a problem if you're poor. You know, I remember a health visitor telling me recently that they cut health visitor provision and support for any child over 6 months, but they were going to send out a questionnaire to families to say, do you think you're struggling with your child? What self-respecting parent is going to say yes? Yeah, I'm really finding it hard. I don't think I'm bringing my child about. You know, seriously, you don't do that, do you? Because what are the authorities? They're not going to give you a service. They're going to start questioning your parenting. So you end up in a complete, you know, knot in terms of being able to access help, even if that's what you think that you need to do. I think one of the people, I think you said something about money being moved from early intervention to late intervention. I have a slight problem with that, because I just think the money's being axed. There isn't more money for late intervention. What you've got now across the country are, if they're not cutting, I mean, late intervention basically means social work. Social workers do child protection now. They don't do any other sort of work. And most authorities have cut social work jobs. If they've kept them as they are, then the statistics about the hundreds of % of increase in referrals are very, very clear. They're now introducing a beautiful phrase called contextual safeguarding, which is the phrase they use for having to now do conferences and to do child protection plans on children who are in gangs and children who are being sexually exploited. And there are no extra services for this. There is no training for this situation, but it's the way that the government's going to be able to justify the fact that they've got no provision whatsoever for people in those situations, young people in those situations, to try and fudge this notion that somehow they are providing some sort of service and support, and it clearly isn't true. So I think it's really important that in the here and now, as I said before, we fight for all those services to be there. Do you know, that we talk about provision for children, we talk about youth services, all those kind of things. But I still think there is a limitation to what capitalism can do, because of the very nature of the system and the fact that it relies on this private family unit to basically raise children and all the problems that go with that. You know, at the very least, because you haven't got very many adults around you, you can, you know, get lots of ideas from anything. I actually think there's a much, much better way of raising children. And, you know, if you look at the model, say, of a socialist society, the ideas that go behind, you know, the idea of socialised child rearing, then, you know, you can look at something like the Russian Revolution. In 1917, within weeks of the revolution starting, you'd got things like free childcare available to everybody. You had catering setups going on, so there were canteens for people to eat. You didn't have to go home and cook your tea. You could go and get a nutritious meal for a reasonable price. And you imagine the impact that had on women in particular, of not having to raise, you know, worry about their day-to-day childcare and cook a meal and wash clothes and all those kind of things. They're very basic things, but they are absolutely liberating. Never mind the free divorce on demand, which I think was probably the most liberating bit of it all. Abortion, all of those things that we still fight for now were made available straight away. The impact it had, and of course anything that benefits women inside of a family unit also benefits the men. Do you know what I mean? It's not, there's a relationship between these things, and I think these things are very, very important. So I do think that we have to look at very, very different ways in the future about how we raise children. We need to free women up from the, you know, I'm not saying it's great bringing kids up, but there's ways of doing it that mean you enjoy it and you have pleasure in it, and there are ways where you just think this is grueling monotony and I'm stressed. And, you know, if you think about, I've done a terrible, horrible job, I've gone home with a headache and I'm stressed, and now I've got to be nice to my children. You know, this is a picture that everybody can talk about. It's not easy for people. We can free people up from these sort of things. We can provide jobs for people that actually satisfy them, that they're engaged in creative. You know, Marx talked about us being creative animals, socialised animals. You know, I really would like to be a gardener, if I'm really honest about it. That's what I want to do. You can't get a job in gardening that pays a decent wage. You know, there are things that the society needs, huge things, you know, hospitals, it needs all sorts of things, and actually the jobs aren't there for people, and the pay certainly isn't there. So, you know, a society that actually looks at providing work for people that is satisfying and fulfilling, so they actually have a sense of achievement. It's not you know, that revolutionary, but actually it feels like an awful long way away. And I think the most important thing is actually that we have a society that is based on meeting people's needs. At the moment, we have a system that will only, even, you know, with a bit of money in the system, all capitalism will do is satisfy the needs of the ruling class and make sure that we've got enough services to be able to go to work on a day-to-day basis and create their profits. That's what we do. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to depress people too much, but actually that is the basis of the system. You know, it's a system that says we won't provide the service if we can't make money out of it. It's an obscenity to suggest that we should make profits out of hospitals, or we should make profits out of childcare, or any of those things. We need a society that says we will provide for the needs of ordinary people, and we will fulfil those ordinary people. We will make sure that Black and Asian kids fulfil their potential. We will provide an education system that really doesn't, you know, discriminate against people. Working class kids. You know how many kids that talk about, I want to be a rocket scientist? There was a guy in a meeting recently that was saying he was told very clearly that he was never going to be that because he was poor, and to think of something much more, you know, down to earth and sensible for a child like him. Why can't our kids be rocket scientists? You know, it's the system that says they can't. We have to fight for a much better system. We have to transform the world that we live in. That's why I'm a member of the SWP. That's why I believe in revolution. If you believe in that, join us as well. But that fight has to happen, because all we'll do is stick a sticking plaster over a gaping wound. That is not what this should be about. Social workers want better than that. Lots of other care workers do. Let's fight for a better society.